Some love stories begin with a whisper. Theirs began with a war. The wedding bells of St. Augustine Chapel rang through the crisp October morning 4 years ago, their melodic chimes defying the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Connor Whitmore stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the oak doors at the end of the aisle. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves about marriage, but from the knowledge that half the pews sat empty, filled only with accusatory stares from his own family. Margaret Whitmore sat in the front row like a queen in exile, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, her black Chanel suit chosen deliberately to suggest she was attending a funeral rather than a wedding. The diamond brooch on her lapel, a family heirloom worth more than most people's homes, caught the chapel's stained glass light and threw fractured rainbows across the marble floor. Beside her, Victoria Whitmore dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though anyone watching closely would notice no actual tears. Her perfectly applied makeup remained intact, her breathing steady, her performance flawless. The rest of the Whitmore clan filled the left side of the chapel with the enthusiasm of mourners, their collective silence more deafening than any protest. The chapel itself bore witness to generations of Whitmore celebrations, christenings, confirmations, and weddings that had united fortunes rather than hearts. Oil paintings of long-dead patriarchs gazed down from gilded frames, their stern expressions seeming to pass judgment on this latest disruption to family tradition. The altar, carved from Carrara marble imported a century ago, had never hosted a ceremony quite like this one, where love battled legacy and won, despite the cost. When those oak doors finally opened, Connor's world shifted on its axis. Lorna Hayes emerged like a vision crafted from moonbeams and midnight, her grandmother's vintage ivory gown flowing around her like liquid starlight. The dress, altered to fit her curves, told its own story of resilience, passed down through 3 generations of strong women who had learned to create beauty from whatever materials life provided. Her dark skin glowed against the delicate lace, and her natural hair was crowned with baby's breath and pearls that had belonged to the grandmother who raised her in Georgia before New York called her north with promises of artistic recognition. She carried a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus, each flower chosen for meaning rather than mere beauty. Roses for love, eucalyptus for protection, baby's breath for everlasting devotion. Her choice to walk down the aisle alone was a statement of independence that made Connor fall in love with her all over again, but also a practical necessity born from family division. Diana Hayes sat in the back pew, her presence feeling more like a judge arriving to deliver a verdict than a mother come to celebrate. The sight that stopped Connor's breath wasn't just his bride's radiant beauty, it was the recognition of what this moment represented. Every step Lorna took toward him was a step away from safe choices, from a world that would have accepted her without question if she'd simply loved someone else. She was choosing him not despite the opposition, but with full knowledge of what that choice would cost them both. The past 12 months had been a battlefield disguised as a courtship, though the seeds of conflict had been planted much earlier. Connor had first seen Lorna at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's charity gala, 15 months earlier, where her mixed-media sculpture, Fragments of Home, had commanded the center of the contemporary wing. The piece incorporated broken pottery from her childhood home in rural Georgia, dishes her grandmother had served Sunday dinners on, cups that had held sweet tea during summer evenings on the porch, transformed into something transcendent through the addition of gold leaf and copper wire. "It's about finding wholeness in the broken pieces," Lorna had said that night, her fingers tracing the sculpture's golden veins while Connor stood transfixed in the small crowd gathered around her work. Sometimes what we think destroys us actually reveals our most beautiful parts. My grandmother used to say that scars are just places where we grew stronger. Connor introduced himself simply as someone who appreciated art, deliberately omitting his last name and the $3 billion pharmaceutical empire that came with it. He'd grown tired of conversations that changed the moment people learned his identity, tired of women who saw his bank account before they saw his soul. That evening, they spent hours walking through the museum's halls, debating the emotional impact of Georgia O'Keeffe versus the intellectual complexity of Jean-Michel Basquiat. When Lorna laughed at his terrible joke about abstract expressionism, something about how modern art was like his family's dinner conversations, requiring interpretation and often leaving everyone confused, Connor felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that he'd been holding his breath his entire life until this moment. Their courtship unfolded like a secret rebellion against two families' bitter histories. Diana Hayes had once been married to Connor's uncle in a union that had promised to bridge worlds, but instead built walls of resentment and financial ruin. When the uncle had gambled away Diana's inheritance and left her with crushing debts, the divorce had torn through both families like shrapnel, leaving wounds that 20 years hadn't healed. Diana's warning echoed in Connor's memory even now. That family will consume everything you are and leave you with nothing but their name and empty pockets to show for it. The Whitmore opposition had been swift and merciless, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Margaret had hired private investigators to dig up every detail of Lorna's background, searching for ammunition in her modest upbringing, her student loans, her mother's failed marriage. Victoria had orchestrated accidental encounters at social events, making cutting remarks about Lorna's background within earshot of society reporters who were always hungry for gossip about the pharmaceutical fortune's heir. They'd sabotaged gallery showings by pressuring board members who depended on Whitmore donations, spread whispers about Lorna's fortune-hunting intentions at country clubs where reputation could be destroyed over afternoon tea, and made it clear that acceptance into their world would never come. But Connor had chosen love over legacy, passion over pedigree. He'd liquidated personal assets to fund Lorna's first solo exhibition when galleries mysteriously withdrew their offers after intimidating phone calls from concerned patrons. He'd stood by her through brutal society page attacks that questioned everything from her artistic talent to her motives for dating him. When his grandfather threatened to cut him from the family will, Connor had laughed and said he'd rather earn his fortune than inherit shame disguised as money. Each battle had only strengthened his resolve, and Lorna's quiet grace under pressure had proven she was worthy of any war they might wage. The ceremony proceeded with the Reverend officiating, the same minister who had married Connor's parents 30 years earlier. His words about love conquering all obstacles carried extra weight in the charged atmosphere. When Connor spoke his vows, his voice rang clear and unwavering. "I choose you, Lorna. Not just today, but every day that follows. I choose our love over their hatred, our future over their past." Lorna's response brought tears to the small gathering of true supporters. "In a world that tried to break us apart, you became my strength. In a family that called me unworthy, you made me feel like a queen. Today I don't just marry you, Connor. I choose to build a dynasty of love that will outlast every obstacle they place before us." The kiss that sealed their union felt like both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of their long battle to be together and the start of a war neither of them saw coming. As rice fell around them on the chapel steps, Connor caught sight of Victoria's expression, something dark and calculating, flickering behind her practiced smile. Diana Hayes approached them as guests dispersed, her embrace with Lorna brief but significant. "You've made your choice," she whispered to her daughter. "Now you must be stronger than I ever was." To Connor, she offered only a firm handshake and words that would haunt him. Love her enough to recognize when they're destroying her because they will try. Margaret Whitmore swept past without acknowledgement, but Victoria paused, pressing air kisses to both their cheeks. "Welcome to the family, darling," she said to Lorna, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes winter-cold. "I do hope you're prepared for everything that comes with our name." Something in her tone made Connor's protective instincts flare, though he couldn't identify the specific threat. As their wedding car pulled away from the chapel, Lorna rested her head against Connor's shoulder, exhaustion finally showing on her face. "Was I foolish to think your family might learn to accept me?" she asked quietly. Connor's jaw tightened as he watched the chapel disappear in the rearview mirror, Victoria's figure still visible on the steps, her smile never wavering. He had won the battle to marry Lorna, but something in Victoria's parting words suggested the war was far from over. Chapter 2. Beautiful Moments in Paradise. In the golden hours of early marriage, love becomes a language spoken in gestures, too beautiful for words, written in actions that require no translation. Connor woke before dawn on their 6-month anniversary, moving silently through their Tribeca loft so as not to disturb Lorna. The morning light painted geometric patterns across the hardwood floors they'd chosen together, highlighting the easel. By the windows, where Lorna's latest painting captured the Manhattan skyline in bold strokes of amber and crimson. The canvas showed the city not as tourists saw it, but as Lorna experienced it, a place where dreams took physical form in steel and glass, where every sunrise offered the possibility of reinvention. This morning marked the culmination of a secret he'd kept for 4 months, a surprise that had required him to fail spectacularly at pottery classes every Tuesday and Thursday evening. His instructor, Mrs. Peterson, a 70-year-old woman with no patience for wealthy dilettantes, had threatened to ban him from her studio after his third attempt at a simple bowl resulted in what she called an abstract disaster that would make Jackson Pollock weep. But Connor had persisted, driven by a vision that required his own clumsy hands rather than hired perfection. The basement had been transformed into something from an artist's fever dream. Professional-grade kilns hummed quietly in corners, their digital displays glowing like technological stars. Track lighting illuminated workstations outfitted with every tool a sculptor could desire. Wire end tools, ribs, loop tools, needle tools, all arranged with surgical precision. He'd consulted with art professors from Cooper Union, pottery masters from local galleries, and museum curators who specialized in contemporary sculpture to create this space. But the centerpiece remained his own amateur handiwork, a sculpture of 2 hands, fingers intertwined, crafted from clay and glazed with gold leaf. The piece was imperfect in ways that made it beautiful, one thumb slightly longer than the other, a fingerprint pressed too deeply into the clay, glaze that had run in thin rivulets during firing. It looked exactly like what it was, the work of someone who had never held clay before, but had poured 4 months of devotion into learning how to make his love tangible. When Lorna discovered the studio that evening, her sharp intake of breath told Connor everything. She moved through the space like a queen surveying her domain, her artist's eye cataloguing possibilities and potential. The lighting was perfect for detailed work. The ventilation system would protect her from fumes. The storage areas could hold years' worth of projects. But it was the sculpture that stopped her completely. At the intertwined hands, she paused, recognizing their hands immortalized, despite Connor's amateur technique. The imperfections didn't diminish its power. If anything, they enhanced it, proof that love didn't require perfection to be profound. "There's something hidden inside," Connor said softly, his voice thick with nervous energy. Lorna's eyes widened as she realized the sculpture was hollow, designed to open like a ceramic egg. Inside, nestled in silk that matched her wedding dress, lay a spare key to their home and a note in Connor's handwriting. "Even if the world locks us out, we'll always have each other." The tears that followed were joyful, and Connor knew he'd given her more than the studio. He'd given her a cathedral for her creativity. Their paradise faced its first test during Hurricane Ida the following September. The storm had been forecast as manageable, but nature proved more vicious than predicted. By evening, their neighborhood was submerged under 3 feet of rushing water that turned familiar streets into dangerous rapids. Connor had been trying to move their car to higher ground when he heard Lorna's scream from their second-floor window. Water was rising faster than anyone anticipated, and the gallery space on their building's first floor, where Lorna kept her completed works, was flooding rapidly. Without hesitation, Connor waded back through chest-deep water that pulled at his legs with surprising force. What followed was a ballet of desperation and love. Connor made 4 separate trips through the treacherous flood, each journey more dangerous than the last. First, he carried Lorna to safety, her arms wrapped around his neck as debris swirled around them. Then, he returned for her paintings, holding canvases above his head while navigating by streetlight and determination. On his 3rd trip, looters had arrived, thinking chaos provided perfect cover. "These belong to my wife," Connor shouted over the storm, standing waist-deep in filthy water, while 3 men debated whether his protective fury was worth challenging. His voice carried such conviction that they retreated, leaving Connor to save the final pieces of Lorna's artistic soul. The image of him emerging from that flood, muddy and exhausted but carrying her life's work, would remain burned in Lorna's memory forever. 2 months later, their marriage survived an attack more personal than any natural disaster. Lorna had been commissioned for a major installation at the Whitney Museum, a career-defining opportunity that would establish her among New York's premier contemporary artists. The piece, Bridges and Barriers, explored the immigrant experience through interactive sculptures that visitors could rearrange to create their own narratives. The sabotage was sophisticated and cruel. Anonymous complaints to the museum suggested Lorna's work promoted anti-American sentiments. Doctored photos appeared online showing her installation beside inflammatory political slogans she'd never written. Social media campaigns questioned her qualifications, her artistic integrity, even her right to represent American experiences as a black woman. The Whitney withdrew the commission 3 weeks before the opening, their apologetic phone call offering no real explanation. Connor found Lorna in her studio, staring at the pieces she'd spent months creating, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "I'm good enough," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. "My work matters." "Your work doesn't just matter," Connor replied, pulling out his phone to make a call that would change everything. "It deserves to be celebrated." Within a week, Connor had purchased a 4-story building in the meatpacking district, hired architects and lighting specialists, and commissioned art handlers to create something unprecedented, a museum dedicated entirely to Lorna's vision. The opening night of the Lorna Hayes Gallery drew crowds that stretched around 2 city blocks. Art critics who had ignored her work suddenly competed to interview her. The New York Times called it a triumph of artistic vision over institutional prejudice. But Connor's most beautiful gesture remained private, revealed only on their 2nd anniversary. That morning, Lorna woke to find their backyard transformed into an exact replica of the rooftop garden where they'd shared their first kiss. Connor had researched suppliers across 3 states to find the precise cherry blossom trees that had framed that moment. hired musicians to play the same jazz trio that had provided their soundtrack, and somehow convinced the chef from their favorite restaurant to recreate the exact meal they'd shared. As they danced under string lights that twinkled like captured stars, surrounded by the fragrance of blooming jasmine and the soft melody of "The Way You Look Tonight," Lorna realized Connor hadn't just remembered their anniversary. He'd preserved their history in living, breathing detail. "How did you remember everything so perfectly?" she asked, her head resting against his chest. "Because that was the night I knew," Connor replied, spinning her gently. "The night I realized I'd found my person, my purpose, my home. Everything worth remembering in my life started with you." These weren't just romantic gestures. They were acts of artistic curation, each moment crafted to honor not just their love, but Lorna's identity as an artist. Connor understood that loving Lorna meant loving her creativity, supporting her vision, and sometimes building the world she deserved when the existing one proved too small to contain her brilliance. Standing in their recreated garden, surrounded by beauty that Connor had manifested purely to see her smile, Lorna felt invincible. She had no way of knowing that 60 miles away, Victoria Whitmore sat in her Park Avenue apartment, researching plant compounds and practicing concerned expressions in her bathroom mirror. The golden period of their marriage was about to end, though neither suspected their greatest enemy would arrive bearing gifts and wearing the mask of family. Chapter 3. The Poison Within. The most dangerous predators are those who hunt with patience, wearing the faces of friends while sharpening their claws in private. Victoria Whitmore arrived at Connor and Lorna's door on a Tuesday morning in March, 18 months into their marriage, carrying a basket of homemade blueberry muffins and an apology that dripped with manufactured sincerity. Her honey blonde hair was styled in soft waves that framed her face perfectly, and her Hermes coat suggested a woman who'd stepped from magazine pages. Everything about her appearance was calculated to disarm, from her nervous smile to the way she fidgeted with her wedding ring. What neither Connor nor Lorna knew was that Victoria's image of pampered socialite concealed a sharp intellect and dangerous expertise. Before her advantageous marriage to Connor's older brother, Victoria had earned a biochemistry degree from Columbia, a fact the family rarely mentioned because it didn't fit their preferred narrative of women as ornamental rather than intellectual. She'd worked for 3 years at a pharmaceutical research laboratory before trading her lab coat for designer dresses, but she'd never forgotten the knowledge that came with understanding how compounds affected human physiology. "I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see," Victoria began, her voice carrying just the right tremor of uncertainty. "But I've been doing soul-searching since the wedding, and I realized how terribly I've behaved." She paused, allowing a single tear to trace her cheek with practiced precision. "I was hoping we could start over, maybe become the sisters we should have been from the beginning." Lorna, ever gracious and hungry for family acceptance, welcomed Victoria into their home with the kind of warmth that made Connor's chest tighten with protective love. She'd been working on a new series of paintings. That morning, her hair pulled back in a colorful headband, paint-stained apron protecting her flowing sundress. The sight of her attempting to clean her hands while simultaneously offering Victoria coffee embodied everything Connor adored about his wife. Her ability to make anyone feel welcomed, even those who had once wished her gone. "I brought your favorite blend," Victoria said, producing a thermos from her expensive handbag. "At least, I hope it's still your favorite. I remember you ordering it at that charity luncheon last year." The self-deprecating laugh that followed seemed genuine enough to fool even Connor, who watched the interaction with the wary attention of a man who'd learned to expect attacks from his own family. What none of them could see was the extensive research Victoria had conducted over months of planning. She'd spent weeks studying Lorna's social media, noting preferences and patterns. She'd interviewed staff at their favorite restaurants, learned about Lorna's mild seasonal allergies, and discovered her tendency to trust too quickly. Most importantly, she'd identified Lorna's deepest vulnerability, her desperate desire to be accepted by Connor's family, to prove she belonged in their world. The coffee was Colombian single origin, exactly as Lorna preferred, with notes of chocolate and caramel that made her close her eyes in appreciation. Victoria had indeed remembered correctly, though she'd also added something Lorna couldn't taste, a measured dose of plant extract that would, over time, create symptoms resembling severe environmental allergies. "This is incredible," Lorna said, settling into the comfortable armchair across from Victoria in their light-filled living room. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the art pieces that decorated every surface. "I can't believe you remembered." Of course I remembered," Victoria replied, her smile warm and seemingly genuine. "Your family now, whether I was mature enough to accept it initially or not." The words were chosen precisely, acknowledgement of past wrongdoing coupled with present acceptance, designed to make Lorna lower her guard completely. Connor excused himself to take a business call, kissing Lorna's temple and whispering, "I love you," against her ear. The gesture was automatic, unconscious, the kind of casual intimacy that made Victoria's stomach clench with something darker than mere dislike. She watched Connor leave with calculating eyes, then turned her attention back to Lorna with renewed focus. Over the following weeks, Victoria established a pattern that seemed natural and sisterly. She'd arrive every Tuesday and Friday with small gifts, specialty coffee, artisanal chocolates, imported teas, always accompanied by warm conversation and apparent genuine interest in Lorna's work. She'd ask intelligent questions about artistic technique, compliment Lorna's latest pieces, and share edited stories about Connor's childhood that made Lorna feel included in family history. "He used to build these elaborate blanket forts when he was 8, Victoria would say, laughing as she helped Lorna arrange flowers in the studio. "He'd spend hours getting the angles just right, then invite everyone in for important meetings where he'd serve crackers and juice boxes with deadly seriousness." The anecdotes were real, drawn from Victoria's memory, but shared with ulterior motives. What Lorna didn't realize was that each gift had been selected and subtly altered. The coffee contained increasing concentrations of allergens that would accumulate in her system. The chocolates were infused with plant compounds that would trigger inflammatory responses. Even the tea, imported from a small farm in Sri Lanka, had been treated with substances that would create respiratory irritation over time. Victoria's greatest talent lay in her patience and her ability to appear genuinely concerned as Lorna's health began to deteriorate. When Lorna mentioned feeling unusually tired, Victoria suggested stress from her demanding exhibition schedule. When Lorna developed a persistent cough, Victoria recommended a humidifier and offered to research the best brands. When Lorna's skin began showing signs of irritation, Victoria arrived with expensive lotions and the number of a dermatologist she absolutely swore by. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Victoria would say, her brow furrowed with apparent sisterly worry. "Connor works such long hours, and you're trying to match his intensity with your art. It's no wonder your body is rebelling." The comments were designed to plant seeds of doubt about Connor's devotion, subtle enough to seem like genuine concern, but pointed enough to create anxiety. The psychological component of Victoria's campaign proved as damaging as the physical. She'd make offhand comments about Connor's previous relationships, describing women who had been unable to handle the pressure of being a Whitmore wife. She'd share stories about family members who had struggled with Connor's demanding schedule or found the social expectations overwhelming. Each comment was delivered with apparent innocence, but the cumulative effect was to make Lorna question her own strength and suitability. Connor noticed changes in his wife, but attributed them to natural causes. Lorna had always been sensitive to seasonal shifts, and her increasing workload as her reputation grew would explain her fatigue. When she began declining social invitations or seeming less enthusiastic about events they'd previously enjoyed together, he assumed she was simply focused on her art. The changes were gradual enough to seem like normal life evolution rather than deliberate sabotage. Victoria's masterpiece of manipulation came during their 6th month of sisterly bonding. She arrived to find Lorna struggling with a particularly ambitious sculpture, her movements sluggish and her usual precision compromised by the toxins gradually accumulating in her system. "You don't look well at all," Victoria observed, genuine, alarm coloring her voice, though the emotions stemmed from excitement rather than concern. "Have you been to see a doctor recently? These symptoms seem to be getting worse rather than better." The suggestion that prompted a medical consultation was Victoria's greatest gamble and most crucial victory. She needed Lorna's condition documented to create a medical paper trail that would support the more dramatic phase of her plan. She also needed Connor to witness Lorna's declining health through official channels, to make him doubt his own observations and rely on professional opinions. As Lorna made her first appointment with Dr. Walsh, Victoria sat in her Park Avenue apartment that evening, reviewing her progress with the methodical satisfaction of a chess master executing a complex endgame. Phase 1 was nearly complete, establishing trust, creating symptoms, and positioning herself as the concerned family member. Phase 2 would require more dramatic measures, but Victoria had already identified her ally in the medical system and begun laying the groundwork for what would appear to be a sudden, devastating diagnosis. She poured herself a glass of her finest champagne and raised it toward the window overlooking Central Park, where she could see couples walking hand in hand along the lamplit paths. Soon, Connor would understand that some loves were too dangerous to survive, and some families knew exactly how to protect their own, even from the best of intentions. Chapter 4. Silent Betrayal. The cruelest wounds are those inflicted by hands that pretend to heal, by voices that speak comfort while administering poison. By the time they had been married for over 2 years, Lorna's decline had become impossible to ignore, though its cause remained as mysterious as morning mist. What had begun as occasional fatigue and seasonal allergies had evolved into something far more sinister. Victoria's twice-weekly visits had become a cornerstone of Lorna's routine, something she looked forward to with the grateful affection of someone who finally felt accepted by her husband's family. The Tuesday morning visits had developed their own ritual. Victoria would arrive precisely at 10 o'clock, when Connor had left for his downtown office and Lorna would be settling into her studio work. She'd bring coffee, always the same Colombian blend, always perfectly prepared, and they'd spend an hour discussing art, family, and the subtle navigation required of women in their social circle. "I brought something special today," Victoria announced, settling into the comfortable chair she'd claimed as her own in Lorna's studio. "It's a lavender honey blend from that little shop in Provence I told you about. I thought it might help with your sleep issues." The jar she produced was elegant, wrapped in French paper, with a hand-calligraphed label that spoke of expensive authenticity. Lorna accepted the gift with enthusiasm, though her movement seemed slower than usual, her coordination slightly compromised. The tremor in her hands, barely perceptible but definitely present, made opening the jar more challenging than it should have been. "You're trembling," Victoria observed with apparent genuine concern. "How long has that been happening?" "Just the past few weeks," Lorna replied, trying to minimize what was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Dr. Walsh thinks it might be related to stress. My exhibition schedule has been pretty intense lately. The explanation sounded reasonable, even to her own ears, but Victoria noted the defensive quality in Lorna's voice, the tone of someone trying to convince herself as much as others. What Lorna couldn't see was the meticulous documentation Victoria maintained in a leather portfolio she kept locked in her safe. Each visit was recorded with scientific precision, dosages administered, symptoms observed, Lorna's emotional state and physical appearance. The honey contained a measured mixture of allergens and mild neurotoxins that would accumulate over time, creating symptoms that mimicked several serious conditions without pointing to any specific disease. Victoria had spent months researching her methods, consulting with experts under the guise of writing a thriller novel. She'd learned about substances that could cause neurological symptoms, respiratory distress, and skin conditions while remaining virtually undetectable in standard medical screenings. Her background in biochemistry proved invaluable in creating a poisoning profile that would baffle medical professionals. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Victoria continued, stirring honey into her own coffee with deliberate slowness. "About feeling like Connor's been distant lately. Have you considered that he might be concerned about your health, but afraid to say anything?" The question was planted like a seed in fertile ground, designed to grow into self-doubt and relationship anxiety. "He has been working later than usual," Lorna admitted, though even as she spoke the words, she felt disloyal. Connor had been nothing but supportive, arranging his schedule around her medical appointments and showing no signs of the frustration or resentment Victoria was suggesting. "But I think that's just the pharmaceutical industry. There's always some crisis requiring his attention." Victoria nodded sympathetically while mentally noting Lorna's defensive response. The toxins were affecting her cognitive processing, making her more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of logical analysis. "Of course, you know him better than anyone. I just worry that men sometimes don't know how to handle it when their wives are struggling. They want to fix things, and when they can't..." She let the sentence trail off meaningfully. The psychological warfare was as measured as the chemical assault. Victoria had studied Lorna's vulnerabilities with the attention of a military strategist, identifying the precise pressure points that would create maximum emotional damage. Lorna's deepest fear wasn't her own illness. It was becoming a burden to Connor, proving his family right about her unsuitability for their world. Each gift Victoria brought carried its own payload of destruction. The artisanal chocolates contained allergens that triggered increasingly severe skin reactions. The imported tea created respiratory irritation that mimicked asthma. Even the expensive hand cream she'd recommended was infused with compounds that would cause contact dermatitis, creating angry red patches that made Lorna self-conscious about her appearance. "I brought something that might help with those skin issues," Victoria would say, producing elegant bottles of lotion or serum. "My dermatologist swears by this brand for sensitive skin." The irony of offering solutions for problems she was creating gave Victoria a sense of artistic satisfaction, as if she were composing a symphony of suffering with herself as the conductor. The most insidious aspect of Victoria's campaign was how it made Lorna complicit in her own destruction. Each time Lorna gratefully accepted a gift, each time she defended Victoria's presence to Connor's occasional puzzled questions about his sister-in-law's sudden devotion, she participated in her own downfall. The guilt Lorna felt for suspecting someone who seemed so genuinely caring only made her more vulnerable to manipulation. Connor began noticing changes he couldn't explain or ignore. Lorna's art, once bold and confident, became tentative and fragmented. Her skin, previously radiant, developed an ashy quality, punctuated by mysterious rashes that appeared and disappeared without apparent cause. Most troubling were the episodes of disorientation, moments when she'd lose track of conversations or seem confused about simple tasks she'd performed thousands of times. "Maybe we should see a specialist," Connor suggested one evening after finding Lorna staring at a blank canvas, paintbrush in hand, looking as if she'd forgotten what she intended to create. "Dr. Walsh is wonderful, but these symptoms seem to be escalating despite her treatment." "Victoria mentioned a neurologist her friend consulted," Lorna replied, though the suggestion made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Someone who specializes in stress-related disorders." She didn't mention that Victoria had also shared stories about marriages that hadn't survived similar health crises, anecdotes designed to make Lorna fear that seeking specialized help might drive Connor away. Victoria's greatest triumph came during a particularly elaborate deception that demonstrated her growing confidence in her control over the situation. She'd arranged to visit during one of Connor's rare afternoon meetings at the apartment, timing her arrival to coincide with what she knew would be one of Lorna's more challenging days, based on the cocktail of substances she'd been administering. "I brought lunch from that little place you mentioned," Victoria announced, carrying elegantly packaged containers that had been prepared at home and repackaged to suggest restaurant origin. "I thought we could have a proper sisterly meal for once, instead of just coffee and conversation." The lunch was exquisite. Seared salmon with quinoa salad, roasted vegetables, and a delicate herb sauce that masked the metallic taste of the additional compounds Victoria had incorporated. They ate in the dining room, surrounded by Lorna's art and the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that made the underlying horror even more grotesque. Midway through the meal, Connor arrived home unexpectedly, finding the two women sharing what appeared to be a delightful lunch. Victoria's performance was masterful. She greeted Connor with genuine warmth, praised Lorna's latest paintings with apparent expertise, and created an atmosphere of family harmony that made Connor's protective instincts relax for the first time. "In months, this is wonderful," Connor said, kissing Lorna's forehead and noting with relief that she seemed more animated than she'd been in weeks. "I'm so glad you two are spending time together." What he couldn't see was the slight tremor in Lorna's hand as she reached for her water glass, or the way her pupils seemed slightly dilated in the afternoon light. Victoria noted these details with satisfaction, while maintaining her persona of the devoted sister-in-law, asking Connor about his work and making intelligent conversation about pharmaceutical industry trends. After Connor returned to his meeting, Victoria began the next phase of her psychological assault. "He seems so relieved to see you looking better," she observed, beginning to clear the lunch dishes with helpful efficiency. "I imagine it's been difficult for him, watching you struggle without knowing how to help." The comment was designed to reinforce Lorna's growing fear that her illness was burdening Connor, that his love might not survive the extended test of her declining health. Victoria had planted similar seeds of doubt throughout their relationship, each comment designed to exploit Lorna's deepest insecurities about her worthiness for Connor's devotion. That evening, Lorna would experience her most severe symptoms, yet violent nausea, respiratory distress, and skin reactions that sent Connor into a panic of protective concern. As he held her hair back while she vomited and called their doctor for emergency advice, neither of them suspected that the devoted sister-in-law, who'd shared such a pleasant lunch, bore responsibility for Lorna's suffering. Victoria returned to her apartment that night and updated her documentation, noting the successful escalation of symptoms and the positive response to her expanded dosage regimen. Phase 2 of her plan was proceeding exactly as designed, and soon it would be time to involve her ally in the medical system, someone who could provide the devastating diagnosis that would give Connor permission to abandon his increasingly burdensome wife. The next morning, Connor would find Lorna collapsed in their bathroom, her breathing shallow and her skin covered in angry welts that seemed to appear overnight. The ambulance would arrive within minutes, but the damage would already be done, not just to Lorna's body, but to Connor's faith in his ability to protect the woman he loved more than his own life. Chapter 5. The Diagnosis. Sometimes the most devastating truths arrive wrapped in clinical terminology, delivered by gentle voices that shatter worlds with their professional compassion. The emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital hummed with controlled chaos at 3 o'clock on that Thursday morning, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across faces marked by pain and worry. Connor paced the waiting area like a caged animal, his expensive suit rumpled from hours of holding Lorna, his hands shaking from too much coffee and too much fear. The image of finding her collapsed in their bathroom, her breathing labored and her skin covered in spreading hives, played on endless repeat in his mind. Dr. Williams emerged from behind the double doors that separated families from medical reality, her scrubs bearing the subtle stains of a long shift, and her expression carrying the neutral demeanor that medical professionals develop to survive emotionally devastating news. Connor read her face before she spoke, felt his world tilt on its axis before she'd uttered a single word. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to talk," she said, guiding him toward a small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. The plastic chairs were designed for easy cleaning rather than comfort, and the motivational posters on the walls seemed to mock the gravity of whatever news was coming. Lorna lay sedated in room 314, surrounded by monitors that traced her vital signs in digital green lines. The IV in her arm dripped clear fluid that carried medications designed to counteract whatever was attacking her system, though the doctors still couldn't identify the specific cause. Her natural hair was spread across the white pillowcase like a dark crown, and her peaceful expression in sleep made Connor's chest ache with protective love. "The blood work reveals some concerning patterns," Dr. Williams began, consulting the tablet that contained Lorna's electronic medical record. "We're seeing elevated levels of inflammatory markers, unusual protein concentrations, and traces of compounds that shouldn't be present in a healthy person's bloodstream." She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood the power of medical language to destroy hope. Connor felt ice forming in his veins, despite the hospital's oppressive warmth. "What kind of compounds? What do they mean?" "Some appear to be plant-derived alkaloids. Others are synthetic compounds that might be found in certain medications or environmental toxins." Dr. Williams set down her tablet and leaned forward, her voice softening with genuine compassion. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Has your wife been experiencing any unusual stress? Any changes in her environment, her diet, her routines?" She's been working more, preparing for several exhibitions, but nothing that would explain this level of whatever this is. "The pattern we're seeing is consistent with chronic low-level poisoning," Dr. Williams said, the words hanging in the air between them like a death sentence. "The compounds in her system suggest repeated exposure over several months, possibly longer. This isn't accidental environmental contamination. Someone has been deliberately introducing these substances into her body." Connor's world exploded into white noise and fragments of impossible truth. The words deliberate and poisoning ricocheted around his skull, refusing to form coherent meaning. Someone had been hurting Lorna, intentionally and methodically, while he'd been oblivious to her danger. The protective rage that filled his chest was so complete, it left room for nothing else. Not fear, not confusion, not even the devastating guilt of his failure to see what was happening. "That's impossible," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. The evidence was there, had been there for months if he'd been paying attention. Lorna's declining health, her increasing anxiety about being a burden, her growing isolation from activities they'd once enjoyed together. Someone had been orchestrating her destruction while wearing the mask of care or friendship. Dr. Williams continued with the clinical details that would reshape Connor's understanding of the past year. The compound suggested someone with sophisticated knowledge of biochemistry, someone who understood how to create symptoms that would baffle standard medical screening. The dosages were calculated to cause maximum suffering while remaining below levels that would trigger immediate suspicion. "Most concerning is the neurological component," she said, pulling up brain scans on her tablet. "We're seeing inflammation in areas that control motor function and cognitive processing. If exposure continues, the damage could become permanent. We're talking about potential long-term effects on memory, coordination, possibly even personality changes." Connor stared at the brain scans without really seeing them, his mind racing through possibilities and arriving at conclusions that made his blood run cold. Who had access to Lorna regularly? Who possessed the knowledge and resources to orchestrate something this sophisticated? Who had the motivation to destroy his wife so thoroughly? The answer, when it came, felt like being struck by lightning and drowning simultaneously. Victoria's sudden transformation from family enemy to devoted sister-in-law, her regular visits with prepared gifts, her apparent concern about Lorna's health, coupled with subtle suggestions about the strain on their marriage. The timing of her arrival in their lives coinciding with the beginning of Lorna's mysterious illness. "I need to see my wife," Connor said, standing so quickly that Dr. Williams reached out to steady him. The rage building in his chest threatened to consume his ability to think rationally, but he forced himself to focus on what mattered most: protecting Lorna and ensuring her recovery. In the hallway outside Lorna's room, Connor encountered the nurse who would change everything. Janet Morrison had worked in emergency medicine for 15 years, long enough to recognize patterns that younger staff might miss. She approached Connor with the demeanor of someone about to share unofficial information that could have serious consequences. "Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to speak with you privately about your wife's case," she said, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I've seen similar presentations before, and I'm concerned about what might happen if the exposure continues." Connor felt his world narrow to this single conversation, this moment when someone finally understood the magnitude of what was happening to his wife. "What are you saying?" "The compound profile we're seeing, it's not random environmental. Exposure. Someone with medical or scientific knowledge has been deliberately poisoning your wife, and they're escalating." Janet's voice carried the weight of experience and the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out. "If this continues, Mr. Whitmore, your wife will die. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually her system will fail." The words hit Connor like physical blows, each syllable confirming his worst fears, while simultaneously crystallizing his resolve. Someone was trying to murder his wife slowly, methodically, while maintaining the perfect cover of concern and family devotion. The sophistication of the plan suggested someone who knew them intimately, someone who understood their routines and vulnerabilities. "There's something else," Nurse Janet continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've seen cases like this before, usually in situations involving inheritance disputes or insurance fraud, but sometimes it's just about removing someone who's perceived as a threat to family dynamics or social position." Connor's hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic crime. This was calculated elimination disguised as family bonding. Someone had decided Lorna didn't belong in their world and had chosen the most cruel and cowardly method possible to remove her from it. "What do I need to do?" Connor asked, his voice carrying the steel of someone who'd just discovered the lengths. He was willing to go to protect what mattered most. "Document everything," Nurse Janet replied. "Every gift, every meal, every interaction your wife has had with anyone who might have access to her food or drinks. And you need to get her somewhere. Safe, somewhere the poisoning can't continue." She paused, studying Connor's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart by violence. "But most importantly, you need to be careful about who you trust. Whoever is doing this has been planning for a long time, and they're close enough to your wife to maintain regular access." As Connor returned to Lorna's room, where she lay unconscious and vulnerable under the harsh hospital lighting, he made a decision that would define the rest of their lives together. He would find whoever was trying to destroy his wife. He would gather evidence of their crimes, and he would ensure they faced consequences for every moment of suffering they'd inflicted on the woman he loved more than his own existence. But first he had to save Lorna's life, even if it meant making sacrifices that would test the very foundation of their marriage. The plan forming in his mind was dangerous and would require him to become someone he'd never imagined being. A man willing to lie to his own wife, if that's what it took to protect her from an enemy who shared his blood and called herself family. Chapter 6. The Impossible Choice. In the darkest hours of love, we discover what we're truly capable of, and sometimes that discovery changes us in ways we never expected to survive. Connor sat in the hospital's family conference room at dawn, surrounded by medical reports that painted a picture of deliberate destruction disguised as mystery illness. Dr. Williams had assembled a team of specialists, toxicologists, neurologists, hepatologists, each contributing pieces to a puzzle that formed a terrifying image of sophisticated poisoning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanical insects, and the smell of institutional coffee couldn't mask the underlying scent of antiseptic and despair. The good news is that we've identified most of the compounds in her system, Dr. Davis, the toxicologist, explained as she arranged lab results across the conference table like evidence in a criminal trial. Plant alkaloids, synthetic neurotoxins, allergens that have been concentrated and refined. Whoever is doing this has extensive knowledge of biochemistry and access to materials that aren't available to the general public. Connor studied the reports without really seeing them, his mind reeling from the confirmation that someone had been methodically murdering his wife while he'd been obliviously going about his daily routine. The guilt threatened to consume him. How had he missed the signs? How had he failed so completely in his most fundamental responsibility as a husband? "The challenging news," Dr. Davis continued, "is that some of these compounds have accumulated in her liver and nervous system. Even with aggressive treatment, complete recovery isn't guaranteed. And if exposure continues—" She let the sentence hang unfinished, but Connor understood the implications perfectly. Dr. Taylor, the neurologist, leaned forward with the demeanor of someone delivering news that would reshape a family's future. "We're recommending immediate specialized treatment at a facility with experience in complex poisoning cases. There's a clinic in London that has pioneered treatments for exactly this type of toxicity." London! Connor felt his world tilt on its axis. The idea of Lorna leaving the country, being thousands of miles away while she fought for her life, made his chest constrict with panic and protective fury. "The Harrington Institute has resources we don't have access to here, Doctor," Taylor explained. "Experimental treatments, detoxification protocols that have shown remarkable success in cases similar to your wife's. But time is critical. Every day of continued exposure reduces the likelihood of complete recovery. Connor looked through the conference room's glass walls toward the ICU where Lorna lay, sedated, her body fighting a war she didn't even know was being waged against her. The monitors surrounding her bed tracked vital signs that fluctuated with each breath, each heartbeat a victory against the poison coursing through her system. The impossible choice crystallized in his mind with brutal clarity. To save Lorna's life, he would have to send her away, remove her from the source of the poisoning while he investigated and gathered evidence. But he couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Not when she was so physically and emotionally fragile. The knowledge that someone in Connor's family had been trying to kill her might destroy her psychologically, even if the medical treatment saved her physically. "If I send her to London," Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how long would treatment take?" "Minimum 6 months," Dr. Davis replied, "possibly longer, depending on how her body responds to the detoxification process. The compounds we've identified don't clear quickly, and some of the neurological damage may require extensive rehabilitation." Connor closed his eyes and felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 6 months away from Lorna, while she fought for her life. 6 months of maintaining the lie that would protect her while he hunted the person who'd tried to destroy her. 6 months of being the devoted husband from a distance while playing the role of the defeated ex-husband for whoever was watching. The poisoning profile we're seeing, it's escalating. Whoever is doing this is increasing dosages, becoming more aggressive. If your wife returns to her normal environment without identifying and stopping the source, the next attempt might be fatal. The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of hospital machinery and muffled conversations in nearby corridors. Connor stared at his wedding ring, remembering the day he'd placed it on Lorna's finger and promised to protect her from everything the world might throw at them. He'd never imagined that the greatest threat would come from his own family, wearing the mask of love while administering death by degrees. "I need to speak with my wife," Connor said, standing with the movements of a man who'd aged years in a single night. "And then I need to make some arrangements." In Lorna's hospital room, surrounded by machines that monitored her recovery from the latest attack on her system, Connor held her hand and prepared to tell the most important lie of his life. She was awake but groggy, her dark eyes tracking his movements with the intensity of someone trying to focus through medication and toxin-induced confusion. "The doctors think you need specialized treatment," Connor began, keeping his voice steady, despite the way his chest felt like it was being crushed by invisible weights. "There's a clinic in London that deals specifically with the kind of condition you're experiencing." "London?" Lorna's voice was weaker than usual, raspier from the respiratory distress she'd suffered during the night. "Connor, I can't leave." "You for months. We just got married. This is supposed to be our time together." The pain in her voice nearly broke Connor's resolve, but he forced himself to continue with the performance that might save her life. "You're not leaving me, sweetheart. You're getting better, so we can have the rest of our lives together." He squeezed her hand gently, memorizing the feel of her fingers intertwined with his. "I'll visit whenever I can, and we'll talk every day. This isn't goodbye, it's just temporary." What he couldn't tell her was that he'd already made arrangements to create the perfect deception. He would tell his family that Lorna's condition was terminal, that the stress had become too much for their marriage to survive. He would play the role of the grieving but ultimately relieved husband who was choosing his family's stability over his wife's burden. It would be the performance of his lifetime, designed to make the poisoner believe they'd succeeded while actually removing their target from danger. "I'm scared," Lorna whispered, and Connor felt his heart shatter into pieces that cut him from The inside. What if I don't get better? What if this thing, whatever it is, changes me permanently? What if I come back and you don't love the person I've become? Connor leaned down and kissed her forehead. Tasting the salt of tears, he didn't realize he was crying. "That's impossible," he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite control. "I fell in love with your soul, Lorna. Your art, your kindness, your strength, your laugh, the way you see beauty in broken things. None of that can be touched by whatever this illness is." The irony of his words, talking about broken things, while his own heart was fracturing under the weight of necessary deception, wasn't lost on him. But Lorna smiled for the first time in days, and Connor knew he was making the right choice, even if it felt like dying from the inside out. "I need you to promise me something," Connor continued, pulling back to look directly into her eyes. "Whatever you hear about us, about me while you're gone, don't believe it unless I tell you directly. There might be rumors, or people might say things designed to hurt you. Promise me you'll remember that I love you more than my own life, and that everything I do is to protect what we have together." Lorna nodded, though confusion flickered across her features. "Connor, what aren't you telling me?" "Just promise me," Connor insisted, his voice carrying the intensity of someone sharing final words before a battle. "Promise me you'll trust us, trust what we have, no matter what anyone says or what it looks like from the outside." "I promise," Lorna whispered, though the uncertainty in her voice suggested she sensed undercurrents she couldn't identify. That afternoon, Connor began the most complex deception of his life. He called Margaret and Victoria, his voice modulated, to suggest a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. "We need to talk," he said, "about Lorna, about our marriage, about decisions I never thought I'd have to make." The family meeting he arranged for that evening would mark the beginning of his elaborate performance, the start of a campaign of lies designed to save the woman he loved by appearing to abandon her. As he prepared for the most important acting job of his life, Connor recorded a video message for Lorna on his phone, words of love and encouragement that she could watch during her darkest moments in London. Proof that his devotion was real, even when everything else became performance. But first, he had one more conversation to have with the hospital staff, arrangements to make that would ensure his plan had the best possible chance of success. The next 6 months would test every aspect of their marriage, their love, and Connor's ability to maintain the most crucial lie of his life, that he was willing to abandon his wife to save his own comfort, when in reality, he was sacrificing everything to give her the chance to survive. Chapter 7. The Performance. The greatest actors are those who perform not for applause, but to save the lives of those they love, even when the role demands they become someone they despise. The Whitmore family drawing room had been the stage for countless performances over the decades. Charity galas planned with military precision, business mergers disguised as social gatherings, and family crises managed with the ruthless efficiency of corporate takeovers. But tonight, as Connor prepared for the performance of his lifetime, the Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers felt more like props in a theater where the wrong line could cost Lorna her life. Margaret sat in her usual throne-like chair beside the marble fireplace, her posture suggesting a queen prepared to receive tribute from a wayward subject finally come to his senses. Victoria occupied the antique settee with calculated casualness, her designer dress and perfect makeup creating an image of concerned femininity that made Connor's skin crawl with revulsion. He knew now what lay behind that facade, and the knowledge filled him with a cold rage that threatened to shatter his performance before it began. "I've made a decision about Lorna," Connor announced, his voice modulated to suggest a man pushed beyond his emotional and financial limits. He'd practiced this speech in his empty apartment, perfecting the tone of defeated resignation that would convince them his love had finally crumbled under pressure. The medical bills, the stress, the uncertainty. I can't do this anymore. Victoria's eyes sparkled with something that might have been triumph, though she covered it quickly with an expression of sympathetic concern. Oh, Connor, you must be devastated. I know how much you wanted to make the marriage work, but sometimes love isn't enough when faced with such overwhelming circumstances. The words were chosen perfectly. Acknowledgement of his past devotion, coupled with understanding of his current limitations. Connor recognized the manipulation, the way Victoria was already positioning herself as the supportive family member who'd helped him through this difficult transition. The performance was flawless, and Connor realized he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he'd initially understood. "Where is Lorna now?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the clinical interest of someone discussing a concluded business transaction rather than the dissolution of her son's marriage. "London," Connor replied, allowing genuine pain to color his voice, though the pain stemmed from separation rather than abandonment. "There's a medical facility there that specializes in her condition. The doctors think 6 months of treatment might help, but..." He shrugged with practiced helplessness. "Even if she recovers, what kind of life would we have? Always wondering when the next episode might happen, watching for signs of relapse." The lies tasted like poison in his mouth, but Connor forced himself to continue the performance that would keep Lorna safe while he gathered evidence against her would-be killer. Every word was calculated to convince Victoria that her plan had succeeded, that the destruction of his wife's health had finally driven him to abandon their marriage. "I've had my lawyers draw up divorce papers," Connor continued, producing documents that had been crafted to look authentic while being completely meaningless. "Lorna's too sick right now to deal with legal proceedings, so I'm having them served while she's in treatment. Clean break, generous settlement to help with medical expenses, and we can all move on with our lives." Victoria practically glowed with satisfaction, though she maintained her mask of sympathetic concern. "That must have been such a difficult decision, Connor, but you're still young. You have so much to offer the right woman, someone who can truly be a partner in the life you were meant to live." The barely concealed triumph in her voice made Connor want to wrap his hands around her throat and demand to know why she'd tried to murder his wife. But he forced himself to nod appreciatively, as if Victoria's support meant something to him rather than confirming her guilt in the most heinous betrayal he could imagine. Over the following weeks, Connor perfected the role of the relieved ex-husband, gradually rediscovering his freedom. He made a public appearance at the Met Gala with a companion, actually his private investigator, posing as a socialite, designed to fuel gossip about his rapid recovery from marital disappointment. He moved back into his childhood bedroom at the family estate, playing the prodigal son, grateful to be welcomed home after his romantic misadventure. The performance extended to every aspect of his daily routine. He attended family dinners where Victoria would make casual inquiries about his emotional state, always with the perfect balance of concern and subtle satisfaction. He participated in country club events where society matrons would offer condolences that felt more like congratulations. He even began making noises about returning to the social scene, allowing Margaret to arrange introductions with appropriate women from their social circle. But the real Connor existed in the shadows of this elaborate deception, in encrypted phone calls with Lorna every night at midnight London time, in monthly flights using his company's corporate jet under the guise of pharmaceutical business in Europe. Once a month he would disappear on what he told his family were extended business conferences in Switzerland or Germany, when in reality he was racing across the Atlantic to spend precious long weekends with his recovering wife. The London visits were both paradise and torture. Lorna was improving under the specialized treatment, the toxins gradually clearing from her system as her natural vitality returned. But she was also becoming increasingly suspicious of Connor's explanations for the gaps between his monthly visits. The way he seemed evasive about family interactions, his reluctance to discuss future plans. "Something's wrong," Lorna said during his fourth monthly visit, studying his face with the artist's eye that had first captured his attention. They sat in the private garden behind the Harrington Institute, surrounded by blooming roses that reminded Connor of their wedding bouquet. "You're performing for me, just like you perform for everyone else. What aren't you telling me about what's happening at home?" Connor felt the familiar tug of wanting to confess everything, the poisoning, the investigation, the elaborate deception he was maintaining to protect her. But Dr. Richardson had been clear that psychological stress could interfere with her physical recovery, and Connor couldn't risk compromising her healing for the sake of his own emotional need for honesty. "I miss you," Connor said instead, taking her hands and noting with relief how steady they'd become compared to the trembling weakness of her final weeks in New York. "I miss having you in my life every day, and sometimes I get lost trying to navigate family dynamics without you there to keep me grounded." It was true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. The loneliness of maintaining his deception was consuming him from the inside, made worse by the knowledge that he was lying to the person he loved most in order to save her from someone who shared his blood. Meanwhile, back in New York, Connor's private investigator was gathering evidence that painted an increasingly damning picture of Victoria's activities. Financial records showed purchases of exotic plant materials and laboratory equipment. Security footage from their building revealed her bringing packages to their apartment on days when Lorna's symptoms had been particularly severe. Most damning was the audio recording Connor had captured during one of Victoria's visits to the family estate when she'd bragged to Margaret about her success in handling the Lorna problem. "She became so dependent on my visits," Victoria had laughed, unaware that Connor was listening from the next room. "Always so grateful for my concern, so eager to confide her fears about being a burden to Connor. It was almost too easy. She helped me destroy her own marriage by believing every doubt I planted." The recording was devastating evidence, but Connor needed more before he could spring his trap. He needed Victoria to confess to the poisoning itself, ideally in a context that would implicate any accomplices she might have in the medical system. Nurse Janet had suggested that someone with access to medical records might be involved, possibly someone who could manipulate test results or influence treatment decisions. Connor's investigation revealed that Victoria had been corresponding with Dr. Patricia Cross, a physician who had lost her license for insurance fraud but maintained connections in the medical community. Financial records showed regular payments from Victoria to Dr. Cross, always disguised as charitable donations or consulting fees. The web of conspiracy was larger than Connor had initially realized, involving not just family betrayal, but medical corruption designed to give legitimacy to what was essentially a murder plot. The knowledge that Lorna's suffering had been orchestrated by multiple people, all working together to destroy an innocent woman's life, filled Connor with a rage so complete it threatened to compromise his ability to think clearly. But as he prepared for the final phase of his plan, the staged revelation that would expose Victoria's crimes and protect Lorna from future attacks, Connor drew strength from their nightly phone calls, from the gradual return of his wife's laughter, from the knowledge that his performance was working. Lorna was getting better, her artistic vision was returning, and soon he would be able to reveal the truth of his devotion while ensuring that her poisoner faced justice. The most difficult part of the performance was yet to come: convincing Victoria to confess her crimes while maintaining the illusion that he was grateful for her intervention. But Connor had learned patience from months of deception, and he was prepared to wait as long as necessary to ensure that justice was as thorough as the poisoning itself had been. Chapter 8. Gathering Evidence. In the quiet spaces between performance and truth, justice is built one documented piece at a time, until the weight of evidence becomes impossible to deny. Connor's transformation into a master of deception unfolded over 6 months of the most mentally exhausting work of his life. By day, he played the role of the relieved ex-husband, gradually returning to his family's good graces. By night, he became something entirely different: detective, investigator, and guardian angel to a wife who didn't know the lengths he was going to protect her from a killer who shared their dinner table. The private investigator he'd hired, Sarah Walsh, was a former law enforcement officer who specialized in complex family fraud cases. Her cover as Connor's rebound relationship was so convincing that society photographers had captured them at gallery openings and charity galas, creating evidence of Connor's supposed emotional recovery that Victoria consumed with satisfaction. "She's becoming careless," Sarah reported during one of their meetings in a downtown coffee shop. "The success of her plan is making her overconfident." She started bragging about her manipulation techniques to other family members, always framed as helping Connor see the truth about his inappropriate marriage. Connor reviewed the audio recording Sarah had captured using professional recording equipment. Victoria's voice came through clearly as she described the destruction of Lorna's confidence, the way she'd planted seeds of doubt about Connor's commitment, the satisfaction she felt watching a strong woman slowly crumble under manufactured insecurity. The poisoning was almost artistic in its precision, Victoria had bragged to Margaret during a lunch at their country club, unaware that Sarah was recording from a nearby table. She never suspected that her beloved sister-in-law was the source of her suffering. Even when she was violently ill, she'd thank me for my concern and apologize for being such a burden to the family. The recordings were devastating, but Connor needed more than admissions of psychological manipulation. He needed Victoria to confess to the actual poisoning, preferably in a way that would implicate her medical accomplice and provide evidence of premeditation. The legal case needed to be bulletproof, because Connor had no intention of giving Victoria any opportunity to escape justice or continue threatening Lorna's life. The breakthrough came when Connor staged his most elaborate deception yet, a fake medical crisis designed to make Victoria believe she needed to escalate her methods. He'd arranged with Dr. Williams to create falsified medical records, suggesting that Lorna was recovering faster than expected from her mysterious illness, that the London treatment was more successful than initially hoped. "I'm concerned about what happens when Lorna returns," Connor said during a family dinner, his voice carrying just the right note of anxiety to capture Victoria's attention. "The doctors think she might make a full recovery, and you know how persistent she can be when she sets her mind to something. What if she decides she wants to reconcile? What if she starts investigating what happened during her illness?" Connor watched Victoria's face closely, noting the flicker of alarm that crossed her features before she controlled her expression. The possibility that Lorna might recover completely and begin asking uncomfortable questions was clearly something Victoria hadn't considered in her original plan. "Have you considered that maybe she shouldn't make a full recovery?" Victoria asked, her voice measured but her meaning unmistakable. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let nature take its course, especially when someone is facing such a complex medical situation. The suggestion was delivered with Victoria's trademark combination of false compassion and veiled threat, but Connor recognized it as the opening he'd been waiting for. Over the following weeks, he constructed a scenario that would give Victoria the opportunity to confess her crimes, while believing she was advising Connor on how to complete what she'd started. The final trap was set during a weekend at the family's estate in the Hamptons, where Connor arranged to be alone with Victoria in the study that had been his grandfather's sanctuary. He'd prepared himself emotionally for what he knew would be the most disturbing conversation of his life, using his phone to record their interaction, a simple method that required no special equipment or technical expertise. "I've been thinking about what you said," Connor began, pouring himself a drink with hands that trembled only slightly, not from nervousness about the deception, but from rage at what he was about to hear. "About Lorna's recovery being potentially problematic for all of us. I think you might be right that nature should be allowed to take its course." Victoria's eyes lit up with triumph and something darker, the satisfaction of someone whose plans were finally reaching their intended conclusion. She moved closer to Connor, her hand resting on his arm, in a gesture that was meant to seem comforting, but felt like the touch of a predator claiming its victory. "I'm so glad you're finally seeing clearly," Victoria said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper of someone sharing deadly secrets. "Lorna was never right for this family, never worthy of the Whitmore name, but she would have destroyed you financially and emotionally if we hadn't intervened." "We?" Connor asked, though he already suspected the answer from his investigation into Dr. Cross's involvement. "I couldn't have managed something this sophisticated alone," Victoria admitted, apparently convinced that Connor was now a willing co-conspirator, rather than someone documenting her confession to attempted murder. Patricia Cross helped with the medical aspects. She knew exactly which compounds would create the symptoms we needed without triggering immediate suspicion, and the timing of her hospitalization was perfect for establishing the narrative of terminal illness. Connor felt bile rise in his throat as Victoria described the clinical precision with which she'd orchestrated his wife's suffering. Every detail was planned, from the specific allergens that would create skin reactions to the neurotoxins that would cause tremors and confusion. Even Lorna's final collapse had been timed to coincide with Connor's presence, ensuring maximum emotional impact. The beauty of the plan was how it made Lorna complicit in her own destruction, Victoria continued, apparently oblivious to the way Connor's expression had frozen into a mask of controlled horror. "She welcomed my visits, trusted my gifts, even defended my presence when you occasionally seemed suspicious. She helped me poison her by being so grateful for family acceptance." The phone in Connor's pocket captured every word, every casual admission of attempted murder, disguised as family protection. Victoria described the months of preparation, the research into Lorna's medical history and psychological vulnerabilities, the deliberate calculation of dosages designed to create maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. "And now that she's in London, getting better than we anticipated?" Connor managed to ask, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "Now we ensure that her recovery is temporary," Victoria replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weekend plans rather than murder. "I've already spoken with Patricia about adjusting our approach. The next phase will be more decisive. We can't risk Lorna returning with renewed health and suspicious questions about her mysterious illness." Connor had heard enough to destroy Victoria legally, but he forced himself to continue the conversation until he had every detail of her plans, every piece of evidence needed to ensure she would never threaten another innocent person. The recording that would ultimately seal Victoria's fate ran for nearly 2 hours, documenting not just her confession, but her complete lack of remorse for the suffering she'd inflicted. When Connor finally excused himself from the conversation, claiming he needed time to process their plans for Lorna's future, he felt as though he'd been physically beaten. The casual cruelty of Victoria's admissions, the pride she took in her psychological manipulation, the complete dehumanization of Lorna as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated, all of it carved itself into Connor's memory, with the permanence of scar tissue. But he also felt the satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully tracked dangerous prey. Victoria had confessed to attempted murder, conspiracy, and ongoing plans to complete what she'd started. Dr. Cross's involvement was documented, their methods were recorded in detail, and Connor had enough evidence to ensure both women faced the full consequences of their crimes. Most importantly, he had definitive proof that Lorna was safe as long as she remained in London, away from Victoria's reach. The recordings would be enough to obtain restraining orders, press criminal charges, and ensure that his wife could return home without fear of continued attacks. As Connor prepared for the final act of his elaborate deception, the revelation that would expose Victoria's crimes while revealing the truth of his unwavering devotion, he allowed himself to feel hope for the first time in months. Soon, very soon, he would be able to tell Lorna the truth about everything, to bring her home safely, and to begin the process of healing from the trauma that had nearly destroyed their marriage. But first, Victoria needed to understand that her web of lies and poison had finally collapsed around her, trapping her in consequences she'd never anticipated when she'd first decided that Lorna Hayes Whitmore didn't deserve to live. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Some revelations arrive like dawn, gradual and expected. Others strike like lightning, illuminating everything in one terrible, brilliant instant that changes the landscape forever. Connor stood in the center of the Whitmore family drawing room exactly 6 months after Lorna's collapse, surrounded by faces that had once represented his entire world, but now felt like gathering storm clouds charged with malice and deceit. Margaret occupied her usual chair, with the rigid posture of someone preparing to witness a long-awaited victory. Victoria practically radiated satisfaction, her designer dress and perfect makeup creating an image of feminine triumph that made Connor's chest burn with controlled rage. "I wanted to gather everyone together to make an announcement," Connor said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering news that had been thoroughly considered and finally accepted. "About Lorna, about our marriage, and about the decisions I've had to make over the past few months." The art performance he was about to deliver would be the culmination of 6 months of elaborate deception, the moment when all his planning would either succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically. There was no middle ground, no opportunity for revision or second chances. Everything depended on his ability to maintain the illusion until the precise moment when revelation would have maximum impact. "The divorce papers have been finalized," Connor announced, producing documents that looked official but were actually meaningless props in the elaborate theater of his investigation. "Lorna signed them last week from London. The marriage is over and she's agreed to remain in England permanently. She won't be returning to New York." Victoria's smile was radiant, though she attempted to mask her triumph with an expression of sympathetic concern. "Oh, Connor, that must have been such a difficult conversation. But you're making the right choice, for yourself, for the family, for everyone involved. Lorna will be better off starting fresh somewhere she doesn't have to face the memories of her illness." "Actually," Connor continued, his tone shifting in a way that made Margaret straighten slightly in her chair, "I wanted to thank you specifically, Victoria. Your support during this difficult time has been invaluable. The way you helped me understand the true nature of my situation, the clarity you provided about what needed to be done. I couldn't have navigated this without your guidance." The words were chosen to appeal to Victoria's pride, while simultaneously building the foundation for what was coming next. Connor watched her reaction closely, noting the way her eyes sparkled with satisfaction at receiving credit for what she believed was the successful destruction of his marriage. "I was just being a good sister-in-law," Victoria replied, though her tone suggested she was quite pleased with herself. "Sometimes love means helping people see difficult truths, even when those truths are painful. Lorna was never right for this family, Connor. I think deep down, you always knew that." "You're absolutely right," Connor agreed, his voice carrying conviction that made Margaret nod approvingly. "In fact, I've learned so much about the situation over the past few months, about what was really happening in my marriage, about what was making Lorna so sick, about who was really looking out for my best interests." Connor moved toward the antique sideboard, where crystal decanters caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. His movements were deliberate, calculated to create a moment of suspense before the revelation that would destroy Victoria's world as thoroughly as she had tried to destroy Lorna's life. "I discovered some fascinating things during my investigation," Connor continued, turning back toward his family with something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so cold. "About biochemistry, about the kind of compounds that can make someone mysteriously ill, about how easy it is to disguise deliberate poisoning as environmental allergies or stress-related illness." The change in Victoria's expression was subtle, but unmistakable, a flicker of uncertainty that replaced her earlier confidence. Margaret looked confused, not yet understanding the direction of Connor's comments, but sensing that something was shifting in the room's dynamic. "What are you talking about?" Victoria asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. "I'm talking about this," Connor replied, producing a digital recorder that he placed on the coffee table with the ceremony of someone presenting evidence in a court of law. "I'm talking about conversations that were recorded, confessions that were documented, and material that has been gathered over the course of 6 months of investigation." Connor pressed play, and Victoria's voice filled the room with crystalline clarity. The poisoning was almost artistic in its precision. She never suspected that her beloved sister-in-law was the source of her suffering. Even when she was violently ill, she'd thank me for my concern and apologize for being such a burden to the family. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Victoria's face went white, then flushed deep red as the full scope of her exposure became clear. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she could somehow stop the words that were already filling the room with their damning clarity. "That's not... You can't... How did you..." Victoria stammered, but Connor was already playing. Another segment, this one from their recent conversation at the Hampton estate. Patricia Cross helped with the medical aspects. She knew exactly which compounds would create the symptoms we needed without triggering immediate suspicion. And the timing of her hospitalization was perfect for establishing the narrative of terminal illness. The recording continued for several minutes, each confession more damning than the last, building an undeniable case of premeditated attempted murder. Victoria's voice described the months of planning, the deliberate calculation of dosages, the psychological manipulation designed to make Lorna complicit in her own destruction. "Stop it," Victoria whispered, then louder, "Stop it, turn." "It off. Why?" Connor asked, his voice carrying the cold precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. "These are your words, Victoria, your confessions, your proud descriptions of how you deliberately tried to murder my wife while pretending to be her friend." Margaret found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Victoria, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you couldn't have." But Victoria was past the point of denying what was clearly documented in her own voice. Her facade crumbled as she realized the full scope of Connor's deception, the way he'd played the role of grateful co-conspirator while actually building the case that would destroy her. "She was wrong for you," Victoria screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. "She didn't belong in this family. She was going to ruin everything we've built, everything we represent. I was protecting you, protecting all of us." "By trying to murder an innocent woman," Connor replied, his voice deadly quiet. "By deliberately poisoning my wife while pretending to care about her welfare. By orchestrating her physical and psychological destruction with the kind of clinical precision that would make a serial killer proud." The words hit Victoria like physical blows, each accusation stripping away another layer of her justification until she was left with nothing but the raw truth of what she'd attempted. She'd tried to commit murder, slowly and methodically, while maintaining the perfect cover of family concern. "Where is Lorna?" Margaret asked, though Connor could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand the depth of the deception that had protected his wife. "London," Connor replied, "getting better, recovering from the deliberate poisoning that nearly killed her, learning to trust her own perceptions again after months of being gaslit by someone she thought was family." He turned his attention back to Victoria, who was now crying, though whether from remorse or self-pity remained unclear. "The divorce papers are fake," Connor continued. "The separation is fake. The story about Lorna staying in England permanently is fake. Everything I've told you over the past 6 months has been lies designed to make you comfortable enough to confess to attempted murder." Connor moved toward the window, looking out at the manicured gardens where he'd played as a child, where he'd learned about loyalty and family honor from grandparents who would have been horrified by what their descendant had become. "But here's what's real," Connor said, turning back toward Victoria with an expression that made her shrink back in her chair. "The evidence I've gathered, the recordings of your confessions, the financial records showing your payments to Dr. Cross, the medical testimony about the compounds found in Lorna's system, the documentation of premeditation and conspiracy to commit murder." Victoria's sobs were the only sound in the room as the full scope of her situation became clear. She was facing criminal charges that could result in decades in prison, civil liability that would destroy her financially, and social disgrace that would follow her for the rest of her life. "In approximately 30 minutes, Connor announced, checking his watch with the casual air of someone discussing dinner plans, "Lorna will walk through that front door. She's been on a plane for the past 8 hours, returning to the home where she was deliberately poisoned by someone she trusted, someone she welcomed into her life with nothing but kindness and hope for family acceptance." The front door opened with perfect timing, as if Connor had choreographed the entire scene. Lorna stepped into the foyer, her health restored, her natural radiance returned, looking more beautiful than Connor remembered despite 8 months of separation and medical treatment. She wore a flowing blue dress that brought out the gold flecks in her dark eyes, and her smile when she saw Connor was bright enough to illuminate the entire room. "Hello, family," Lorna said, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had survived an attempt on her life and emerged stronger than before. "I believe we have some things to discuss." Victoria's scream of anguish echoed through the drawing room as she realized that her victim had not only survived but returned to witness her complete downfall. Chapter 10. Forever begins now. Love tested by fire emerges not burned but refined. into something more precious than gold, more enduring than diamonds, more beautiful than anything that came before. 6 months had passed since Victoria's arrest. 6 months since the night when justice finally caught up with someone who had mistaken cruelty for cleverness. The courthouse steps where Connor and Lorna had stood together, watching Victoria led away in handcuffs, already felt like a distant memory compared to the life they were building in the aftermath of surviving an attempt to destroy their marriage. Their home had been transformed into something entirely new, not just physically renovated to remove any trace of Victoria's presence, but emotionally reconstructed as a sanctuary where love was celebrated rather than threatened. The walls now displayed Lorna's latest paintings, a series she called Phoenix Rising, that captured her journey from near death to renewed life in bold strokes of gold and crimson. Connor woke before dawn, on what marked exactly 1 year since Lorna's collapse. 6 months since Victoria's arrest, though today would bear no resemblance to that terrible morning. Instead of hospital visits and poisoning investigations, this anniversary would be marked by the most elaborate surprise he'd ever orchestrated, a celebration not of survival, but of the love that had made survival meaningful. The journey began. Before sunrise, though Lorna didn't know they were on one, Connor had blindfolded her with silk scarves, leading her through the city on what he described as a small adventure to start our new year together. The first stop was the coffee shop in Soho, where they'd had their first real conversation, where Connor had abandoned the pharmaceutical executives he was supposed to schmooze because Lorna's life was more interesting than any business deal. "Can you guess where we are?" Connor asked, guiding Lorna's hands to touch surfaces she might recognize. The worn wooden counter, the espresso machine that hissed with familiar rhythm, the chalkboard menu that still advertised their favorite Ethiopian blend. "Café Noir," Lorna whispered, her voice thick with emotion as memories flooded back. "The morning you told me you'd never met anyone who could make art history sound like poetry. The morning I realized I was in love with your mind before I even knew your last name," Connor corrected, removing her blindfold so she could see that. He'd arranged for the entire cafe to be decorated with enlarged photographs from that day, images neither of them had known existed until Connor's private investigator found them in a photographer's archives from a street life project. Second stop was the rooftop garden, where they'd shared their first kiss, though Connor had transformed it into something that transcended memory and became art. Every element from that original evening had been recreated with painstaking attention to detail, but enhanced with touches that reflected their growth together. The same cherry blossoms bloomed in imported trees, but now they were accompanied by jasmine vines that Lorna had mentioned loving during her recovery in London. The same jazz trio played, but they'd learned new arrangements of songs that had sustained Connor during their months apart. "This is impossible," Lorna said, spinning slowly to take in details that shouldn't exist. "How did you remember everything so perfectly? How did you find musicians willing to learn our entire soundtrack?" "Because that night changed my life," Connor replied, taking her hands and noting with relief how steady they were, how completely. The tremors of her poisoning had disappeared. "That was when I knew I'd found my person, my purpose, my home. I would have memorized the color of every leaf, the sound of every note, the exact way the light fell across your face when you realized we were going to kiss." The third stop was the Metropolitan Museum, specifically the contemporary wing, where Lorna's sculpture, Fragments of Home, had first captured Connor's attention. But instead of her original piece, the space now featured an installation Connor had commissioned from artists around the world, interpretations of their love story rendered in every medium imaginable. Paintings, sculptures, photographs, digital art, even a musical composition that played through hidden speakers, all of it inspired by the relationship that had survived attempted murder and emerged stronger. This is our love story, according to people who've never met us, Connor explained, watching Lorna move through the gallery with the grace of someone returning to her natural element. I sent artists around the world the basic outline. Two people who fell in love despite family opposition, survived a conspiracy to destroy their marriage, and chose each other over everything else the world offered. This is how strangers interpreted what we have together. Lorna paused before a painting that showed two figures dancing in a hospital room, surrounded by medical equipment that had been transformed into something beautiful through the artist's vision. Another sculpture depicted hands intertwined with gold wire, similar to Connor's early pottery attempts, but refined into something museum-worthy. A photograph showed silhouettes embracing against a backdrop of city lights, their love story translated into universal symbols of devotion and perseverance. "They understand," Lorna whispered, tears streaming down her face as she recognized. Their story reflected in the art of people who had never witnessed their struggles firsthand. Complete strangers looked at what we went through and saw something worth celebrating, something beautiful enough to inspire their own creativity. The final surprise was their own home, where the basement studio had been expanded into something that resembled a cathedral of creativity. Professional lighting illuminated workstations that could accommodate any artistic medium she might want to explore. Climate-controlled storage protected canvases and sculptures. A meditation space offered sanctuary for reflection and inspiration. But the centerpiece was something that took Lorna's breath away completely, a sculpture garden that told their entire story in three-dimensional art. Each piece represented a chapter of their relationship, from their first meeting to Victoria's conviction, but the final sculpture was something entirely new. Two figures emerged from a single block of marble, their forms intertwined but distinct, rising from broken pieces that had been reassembled with gold leaf in the Japanese tradition of kintsugi. Finding beauty in broken things, strength in repair. "We didn't just survive the poison, Lorna," Connor said, his voice thick with emotion as they stood before the monument to their love. "We became each other's antidote. Every drop of toxin Victoria put in your system was matched by an equal measure of love, support, and determination to see you healed. She tried to break us, and instead we learned how beautiful we could become when we were rebuilt together." Lorna turned to Connor with an expression that combined love, gratitude, and something that might have been awe. "You did all of this while I was in London? While you were maintaining that horrible deception and gathering evidence against Victoria?" "I did it because I needed something to believe in during the darkest months of my life," Connor replied, pulling her into his arms in the garden that represented their triumph over everything that had tried to destroy them. "I needed to believe that we would survive, that love really could conquer the kind of evil Victoria represented, that our story would have a beautiful ending worthy of all the suffering we endured to reach it." As they danced among sculptures that represented their history, surrounded by art that celebrated their love, with city lights twinkling beyond windows that now looked out on a life rebuilt from broken pieces, Lorna whispered the words that would become their new beginning. "We didn't just survive the poison, Connor. We transformed it into something that made us stronger, more beautiful, more grateful for what we almost lost." Their kiss tasted like forgiveness and hope, like second chances and promises kept, like the kind of love that inspires strangers to create art and poets to believe in happy endings. Outside, the city continued its restless motion, but inside their sanctuary of rebuilt dreams and chosen family, Connor and Lorna had found something rarer than gold, more precious than any inheritance, more enduring than the cruelest attempts to tear them apart. They had found each other, again and again, in every moment when choosing love required courage, when staying together demanded sacrifice, when believing in their future meant fighting for it with everything they had. And in that choosing, that fighting, that refusing to let poison have the final word in their story, they had created something beautiful enough to last forever.